Welcome to the Story a Day podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is Julie from the Story a Day podcast, and I wanted to welcome you here at the beginning of December to the podcast. If you've been listening for a while, if you haven't been listening for a while, this week I want to talk a little bit about the stuff we tend to do at the end of the year, which is looking back and looking forward. And I have a little freebie for you to download, and there's a link in the show notes about that, or you can just come to storyaday.org/episode 191. And it's my looking forward, looking back planner. So it allows you to look back either at the, after you've done a challenge or something like NaNoWriMo, or you can use it to look back at the whole year and look forward. And it's got, my usual exhortations to think about what you wrote, think about what you achieved, celebrate your triumphs, and then think about how you can improve on that. And then later in this episode, I'm going to answer a question that came in from Becky about tips for moving from non-fiction to fiction, which I really enjoyed because I have done that myself. And I've also spoken to some other people who've done that. So I have some thoughts on that. But first, I wanted to talk about this idea of planning for the future and doing it in a way that is very clear-eyed. We are fanciful and creative people in our writing, but that doesn't necessarily serve us if we are being optimistic and overly optimistic and fanciful in our planning, or if we're being overly pessimistic in our planning. I'm currently reading a book by a guy called Jim Loehr, Loehr. It's called The Power of Story, and oddly enough, it's got nothing to do with writing. It's about psychology, and it's about telling yourself the stories that will help you become more successful and more fulfilled in your life. And he points out that stories impose meaning on the chaos. It's how we process everything, right? He says, also, your life is the most important story you will ever tell, and you are telling it right now. Everything we do is framed by our expectations and our memories. When something has happened, how we tell that story to other people, the story of how it happened and what happened, becomes part of our memory. And we shape the memory by the way we tell the story. If it's, these things always happen to me, I was so unlucky, then that's how we remember it, and that's how we feel about the event. To edit a dysfunctional story, Jim Loehr says, you must first identify it. Now, I'm not saying that your story is dysfunctional, but I am saying that there's a lot of wisdom in that idea of looking very clearly at how our lives are going, specifically in this case, our writing lives. So I wanted to give you one more quote from Jim Loehr, which is kind of scary, actually. I'm very much about the you got to show up for your writing, because I know that one of the biggest stumbling blocks for writers at the beginning is just showing up. And you do, to a certain extent, you just have to show up, and you have to give yourself permission to kind of suck. And showing up consistently is one of the most powerful things you can do to get your writing practice going. But once you are showing up regularly, something I notice in everyone who begins to show up regularly and turn up for Story a Day events and things like that, they start to get restless because they're ready for the next step. Showing up is no longer enough, because now that they're showing up, they want to feel like they're making progress in their writing. And that's a natural progression. And in Loehr's book, he talks about this idea that showing up isn't enough. And he says, one of our biggest problems is rooted in our flawed belief that simply investing time in the things we care about will generate a positive return. So I want to make sure that I'm not inviting you to fall into that trap. I do want you to show up. That is the first step. You have to show up for your writing. You have to be writing a lot before you can take that next step. But just showing up isn't enough. Once you're showing up and practicing your writing, you need to start taking the next steps, figuring out with a very clear-eyed look what's not working and what is working. So that's why I'm offering you this free download today of the Looking Forward, Looking Back planner, and it takes you through a lot of this. On the first page of the planner, you'll see an invitation to record concrete achievements. How many pieces did you complete this year? How many stories did you send out into the world? What are the other things that made you proud? There's plenty of space on this page, so you can doodle, you can give yourself gold stars and stickers, you can draw hearts, whatever makes you happy. Fill that page with all of the stuff you achieved this year. And then on the next page, we have space to really consider what didn't quite work out this year. Well, many of us in creative lives have a tendency to focus on what we haven't done yet, which is why the first page is the one that's all about what you really have done, and you might surprise yourself. But the second page here on the worksheet, you're invited to consider what didn't go so well, projects deferred, goals missed, and experiments tried. Now, I put experiments in there because we have to experiment, and failure is part of the process of experimentation. I'm married to a scientist, and when we first got together, he told me that 95% of the work he does will fail if he's lucky. Like, that's a good batting average. That's not a batting average. I don't know sports. Anyway, it's a good number. If you get 5% of your experiments to work right, you're doing really well. It's something that we don't always embrace in the Western culture, for sure. So that page has a little space for things that you've tried, just so you can acknowledge them and you can look at them and you can try and figure out, just remember that all of the work you didn't end up getting published, but all of the work you did was work that deserves to be acknowledged. And if you wrote a bunch of stories in a style that you've now decided that you hate, great, you learned something. I wrote some historical romance stuff a few years ago, and it was fine and I enjoyed it, but I'm not going to be trying to build a reputation as somebody who writes historical romance. So I'll take what I can from that experience and let the rest of it go. On the second page too, part of exercise 2 is to figure out what else was going on in your life. Now, I created this worksheet a couple of years ago and I keep tweaking it, but when I opened it up to take a look at it this year, I sort of laughed because, what else was going on in my life? Well, this year has been challenging. So there's a little space here to remind yourself of all the ways that life did not cooperate this year that caused you to be less productive than you might have planned. We'll have a few things to write there. And then very importantly, at the end of that page, I want you to take a moment, just a few lines, to write some kind words for past you who was dealing with all of this. So just write yourself a nice little note saying you're proud of yourself, or you're pleased with what you managed to do, or something that, just take a moment to be nice to yourself. Exercise 3 is to go back to look at your successes and examine in a dispassionate way what worked and why things were working for you. And there's a couple of different areas you can look at here. What was working in your writing, what was happening what was in your lifestyle that was supporting your writing and making it work, and what was happening in your community. That could be family, friends, wider world. And focus on the things that actually contributed when it was going well, so that you can maybe replicate some of that stuff. In exercise 4, I want you to take a look at what you actually wrote. What worked? What came easily? What length of writing session worked? What style or genre did you like best? Just because this will change from year to year, right? If you've done this worksheet before, drag it out and do it again, and then look at what you filled in 2 years ago. And this stuff may have changed, or there may be more similarities than you realize, which will tell you what direction you want to be going in. So there's a whole bunch of questions in section 4 that you can answer, which are intended to get you looking at long-term trends in your writing. And if you've only just started, you may not have so much to write here. But if you've been writing for a while, this might be useful to help you narrow down to the stuff that you really enjoy. And then in exercise 5, now we can finally get to thinking about next year. A lot of end of year planners are very skimpy, I think, on the looking back section. And I think we need to do a little looking back before we can look ahead. So then we have a section here which lets you think about next year in 3 different buckets. One is the easy wins. Write down some easy wins for yourself next year. Things that you know that you can achieve and that will be fun. You may know that you can do Story a Day May because you've done it before, and it'll be fun because you know you've done it before and you like the people who hang out there. So that might be in your easy win column. There is a leveling up section, something that's more challenging but you're excited to try. Again, Story a Day might be in here for you because you've never quite done Story a Day May. And likewise, stretch goals. Stretch goals might be something that will be awesome, but you're not going to beat yourself up if you miss the mark. So this is something really ambitious that you'd love to try, and you're willing to do it as an experiment. You're willing to take a shot at it, and if it works out, great. And if it doesn't work out, also great, because you're going to learn stuff from it. And it might be writing a novel, or it might be publishing a collection of short stories, or for you, it might be taking part in Story a Day May. It might even be doing the Story a Day 3-day challenge because you've never done anything like that before and you're not sure. That might be on your stretch goal list. So I encourage you to take a close look at that page and think about giving yourself some easy wins. That's okay. You're allowed to put those on your goal list. It doesn't all have to be Mount Everest. And then on exercise 6, I'm going to encourage you to choose some habits that will make those goals happen. So it might be to put writing dates on your calendar. It might be to get accountability. It might be to research X number of markets to publish your book for X hours a month. Or it might be committing to writing a certain number of words a week, or something completely different. And I would encourage you to come to the swagger post at the Story a Day. You could come to the December the 1st one. Just go to the website and there's a drop down at the top under blog, and you can find all the swagger posts, which is the Serious Writers Accountability Group, and post some of these goals that you come up with in the next week or before the end of the month. Or you could come back in January and post your goals for next year. I'd be very interested to hear that. And then at the end of exercise 6, I've got a little section where you can commit to excuses you'll stop making or habits you'll swap out. This might be a little aspirational, but it doesn't hurt to be a little aspirational from time to time. So if you're interested in doing some end of year planning, this is a tool I've put together for you, and I've found it useful. People in the community have found it useful, and give it a try. See what you think. It's all very well to sit down and say, I'm going to do some end of year planning. Sometimes it helps to have a worksheet, right? Sometimes it helps to have a framework so you don't have to invent everything. And we're back, and this week I had a really interesting question from Becky, who is getting back into fiction writing after focusing for a while on non-fiction, and she says, moving from non-fiction to fiction, any tips? So here we go. My history with this is that I started, as most of us do as children, writing stories in school, and everybody, oh, you're a great writer, you've got great imagination, because I wrote and I stole liberally from all the writers that I was reading. I'm sure you recognise this story. It's how most of us start out. Now, as I moved on, I started to specialise in history. Really enjoyed that because I wanted to go into journalism, and so I was writing for a newspaper, I was studying history at university, and these are the pieces where I was getting critical feedback. So I really first built my skills with critical feedback in non-fiction. So I'm pretty confident, went on to magazine writing and blogging and obviously writing stuff for Story a Day. And my training in writing was mostly in non-fiction, and I was pretty competent at that. And all the skills that work for you in fiction, use of ability to wrangle a sentence, that kind of stuff, ability to present compelling ideas, these are things that are useful in non-fiction. But the skills that you use in non-fiction are different. And I really found that when I came back to focus on fiction, there are a few things that I've had to train myself out of. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit now in the hope that this is helpful for Becky and anyone else who's done more non-fiction than fiction. I know a lot of us end up going into things like marketing, communications jobs because you're good at writing and because you want to be a writer, and you end up going into this non-fiction writing field to make a living and then longing to come back to fiction. So there's some things that I've learned I needed to unlearn. The very first thing is going to be the difference between show, don't tell. And unless you were doing that sort of creative non-fiction, new journalism thing where every article starts with a little story, I walked up the gravel path and knocked on the reluctant author's door trying to pursue an interview. It was summer and the sun was setting, which, when I'm reading magazines and newspapers, I don't want that kind of writing. So that's a personal preference. I never did that because I didn't like it. So if you were writing non-fiction that had that creative non-fiction aspect to it, this is going to come a little more easily to you than if you were writing straight journalism, marketing pieces, communication pieces, technical writing, any of that stuff, where your aim has always been to get the information into your reader's head as quickly as possible and persuade them with facts. In fiction, that is not what we're doing. It's all about emotion. And so you want to build a scene. You want to talk about smells and sights and sounds and tastes and lure your reader into the scene, evoke emotions for them. You want to have your characters be very emotional. Everything that they do is informed by their past experiences, and their reactions to everything is layered. It's layered. None of your characters are going to do the obvious thing, because, especially at the beginning of the story, because they've got things to unlearn. They've got behaviors that are protective. They have stories they're telling themselves. They have things to hide. They have stuff they don't know. They have mistakes to make. So instead of telling your reader what a room looks like in a very informative way, which somebody coming from a non-fiction background is going to be really tempted to do, we're going to want to describe the room, and we're going to explain how we're going to show how the person walks through the room and who they meet, and we're going to give backstories on everybody in the room so that the reader has all the information they need, the way that we would if we were putting together a technical document. Not what you want to do in fiction. There is a very strong temptation, as someone who comes from a non-fiction background, to rush the part where you give the reader information. One of the things that has been, took quite a long time, was slow to dawn on me, was that you can hold back. And what you want to do in fiction is create a little mystery. You don't need to tell people why your character is acting the way they are straight away. You want to create that mystery. Why did she hesitate before she knocked on the door? What's that all about? And you give it some kind of like emotional resonance. You show the character hesitating and you make the reader intrigued. Now, in technical writing and non-fiction and journalism, you don't want to do any of that. You want to give the reader the facts they need. But as we have learned, as we mature and as we look around the world and as communication gets more sophisticated and social media gets more sophisticated, and you look at people in the world today, I think it's safe to say that we have all learned over the past however many years that people are not persuaded by facts. People are persuaded by their emotions. And that's the big key with fiction. And it's why fiction isn't a waste of time, which is also something that can be a trap to fall into if you're a non-fiction writer. You can be sold on the idea that non-fiction is more important because it's fact-based, and fiction is just escapism. So that's a mindset thing that you may have to get over as you make the transition to fiction. Fiction is hugely important because fiction changes people's hearts. And once you've changed their hearts about an idea, they will start to look for the facts that back up their their now new bias. So if you have managed to make somebody sympathetic to the plight of a homeless person, they will be rooting for them. No matter where they sit on the, no matter how they felt about homeless people before they came into your story, if you've created a compelling character, you've changed somebody's opinion about that character and about people in that character's situation. So fiction's really important. But the pacing in fiction is very different from non-fiction. In non-fiction, you're trying to like cram all the important stuff at the beginning because people's attention span is short, and non-fiction is not generally structured to hold people's attention. It can be when it's done really well. There are, popular science and popular historian writers who do all this stuff really well. But in general, if you've been in the non-fiction world, you may be conditioned to give the information that, to front load your stories. So that's something to be really aware of and really work on holding back. Not too much, but just be aware that you don't need to give everything out straight away. You want to enchant people. Think about the best storytellers the person who you would sit at a bar and just listen to them talk about their commute because they're so entertaining. That's the change you're making. You're making the change from the traffic reporter on the radio to your Uncle John who tells spellbinding stories about driving down the road with his window down and how his hair all gets sticky out and the way people look at him as they drive past him and all that stuff. Real story from my life. And payoffs into your work. It's not all... It is a logical progression, actually. So you have that going for you. And what you probably have going for you is you're very comfortable with outlining. Non-fiction writers tend to be very comfortable with creating a frame and then arranging the content within it. So you may find that things like story structure books will come in handy for you because you're used to having a structure in which to arrange your information. So it might be really useful for you to look at Save the Cat or Story Engineering by Larry Brooks. Save the Cat is Blake Snyder and the novel version is by Jessica Brody. Story Engineering by Larry Brooks. Lots and lots and lots of story structure stuff out there, which sometimes confounds people who are pure fiction writers because they don't write that way. They want to discover the story themselves. And I think if you're a non-fiction writer, you might get a little frustrated with the round and round and round and the multiple drafts and all that kind of stuff. You're probably quite product oriented as well as process oriented. Pure fiction writers are quite often just enjoying the process. You may be a little more impatient with that. So there's some pitfalls. If your non-fiction work has included screenwriting, well, that's not really non-fiction, is it? But I did hear a conversation a friend of mine had with a screenwriter where the screenwriter was trying to move into fiction and was having a terrible time because she was so used to the actors and the camera people supplying so much of the information for the audience that she wasn't doing that. She wasn't sucking people into the story. She was doing great dialogue, but she wasn't doing the build-ups and the payoffs in terms of painting the picture. So there's just sort of a quick sketch, a quick overview of some things to be aware of when you're moving from non-fiction to fiction. It's a little bit stream of consciousness, for which I apologise, but it's giving me some ideas. Maybe if enough people are interested, I'll put together some information about this, as you can let me know. If anyone else has any other tips, come to the blog, storyaday.org, episode /191 and leave your tips for somebody who is going from non-fiction to fiction. I know there are a lot of you out there. A lot of people in this world come to Story a Day from day jobs as technical writers, marketing writers, and they're struggling to find time for their own fiction. So come and share your journey and tell us what you've done and what you've learned as you have built more space into your life for fiction. That's it for me this week. Please do send your questions along to me at julie@storyaday.org. I love to hear from you. So keep writing, have a wonderful week, and I'll be back again soon.
Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week and of course, keep writing.